Coming up on this week's episode of Why Should I Trust You? Why is the COVID vaccine driving a breakdown in trust for all vaccines today? How did the largest adult vaccination push in U.S. history, with 270 million people getting their shots, described as one of the greatest medical achievements in human history, feed a fire of mistrust that is burning so hot that it's now driving childhood vaccine rates down? We hear from a U.S. Army veteran who was once very much pro-science and pro-vaccination. But after he felt dismissed for what may have been a vaccine injury, he says he doesn't trust science or medicine anymore. And we chat with world-renowned vaccine specialist Dr. Paul Offit about why the COVID vaccine is still driving mistrust in science today, and what, if anything, can be done about it. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. We're your hosts. I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark Abdul-Malik.
I always love, Maggie, it's so clear that,
why are you looking at me?
that Maggie's not the TV person because she always has a 3-second delay.
She's protecting us on the, what is it, the FCC?
FCC? Well, listen, and just so everyone knows, we are journalists. Mark is a physician, Maggie's a virologist, and we're here tackling why so many Americans mistrust science and public health right now. Joining us a little later, as we said, is going to be Dr. Paul Offit. He's a pediatrician specializing in infectious diseases at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and he's a member of the Food and Drug Administration's Vaccines Advisory Committee. I mean, Paul's a giant in the world of vaccines.
Yeah.
So.
Without a doubt.
So look, we're going to speak to Paul in a moment, but big week, y'all. We had the inauguration, and we are officially in the Trump era, and the Trump era of public health. I mean, Mark, you texted me being like, he mentioned public health in the first 5 minutes of his inaugural address.
Yeah, I mean, it was a 30-minute speech, and it was the first chance to kind of talk about what's ahead, and right away tapping into this idea. He says, we have a public health system that does not deliver in times of disaster, yet more money is spent on it than any other country in the world. I mean,
is that true that we spend more than any other country?
I don't know about on public health, but yes, our per capita expenditure on healthcare by far. I mean, it's a talking point that was sort of the impetus even for healthcare reform. I mean, we spend so much, but what do we have to show for it? I mean, it is true. We spend a lot of money.
Yeah, we are now in the Make America Healthy Again era.
To that point, it was interesting to note, obviously, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was there. He's a member of the cabinet. Joe Rogan was there.
Well, he's hoping to be a member of the cabinet.
Oh, yes. I should say that.
Likely.
Thank you, Tom. He has not been confirmed yet. I guess I'm just assuming he's going to go through, and that's something we're going to talk to Paul about too. We'll see what the over/under is on RFK Jr. getting through here. But look, it's clear that this topic of health, public health, trust. Donald Trump talked about a crisis of trust in government. Is very much what we want to tackle on this show, and that's the era we're in right now.
Yeah.
So, here we are. We're doing
pulled us out of the WHO, which I'm sure, Maggie, that headline caught your attention.
It sure did. This wasn't fully unexpected considering what happened last time around. There could be some politics at play to get the World Health Organization to do things slightly differently. I think that there's certainly a need for them to be able to respond to things in a timely fashion. And part of that is funding, and the U.S. does fund a significant portion. But I think it also has wider implications for how we reflect to the world. We're leaving the table for some of these discussions. And I don't know what the ramifications are going to be from that, but I think it's concerning.
The other big headline, too, was Biden's pardoning of Tony Fauci.
Yes.
Even Rand Paul is saying, still in my capacity as a member of the Senate, I'm going to still pursue Anthony Fauci for this COVID deception, for this COVID cover-up, for this COVID scandal that we can lay the blame at his feet. So retribution is very much in the air as well.
That's scary for scientists because that's always been the role, is advisory and to speak up for the data, and then to fear retribution after you've done that. It becomes a really complex system in which then are experts going to be more scared to advocate for the data if they're afraid they'll be come after as administrations change.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump, he does this thing, and he's consistently done this his entire professional career, where he identifies something that is true. And then, of course, he weaponizes it. He does things his way. But the truth here is that there is a real dissatisfaction with mainstream science and mainstream public health. I hear you, what you're saying about retribution and things like that. I think for many people in this country, they fully don't know what the WHO does, what our relationship is with the WHO, why we pay so much money, and they want to understand that. And I think there is going to be this tension between the world of science probably feeling pretty aggrieved at having to defend something that feels settled to them. I get that, because that's got to be really difficult. But like, that's the moment we're in. We can't sort of say, well, we're not going to defend this because it's settled.
We also need to be clear in our own minds about what is mistrust and what am I just confused about? Because I think we quickly lump everything together. And then that is a strategy to generate mistrust, is to inject large amounts of confusing material. And that is a proven strategy to create a void where you start to get confused about trust, mistrust, distrust, misinformation, and really it's a swamp.
We're obviously making a very bold statement with the podcast in general, which is we're saying that what happened during COVID really kicked off a lot of this mistrust that we are seeing right now for science and public health in this country. Yeah. But the COVID-19 vaccine, which we early said, you know, in many ways could be viewed as this sort of miracle of science, to this day is continuing to drive so much mistrust.
Yeah, I mean, there are two versions to the story. You know, you got to remember that more than 1.2 million Americans died of COVID, and that's the landscape that we're in. And the first story is that the COVID vaccine is credited with saving more than 3 million Americans. And without it, we would have had 4 times as many deaths that we did. And that story of the vaccine acknowledges that the vaccine was so helpful, but of course it carried some risk. And, you know, the vaccines underwent rigorous testing on tens of thousands of people. You know, there was safety and adverse events are there, and they're closely monitored. And yes, we did realize that for some people, there are some serious side effects. And then there's another story or another version of reality that the vaccines were raced into arms. It wasn't sufficiently tested. It was forced on the citizens by big government. There was a huge influence from big pharma, and they're sweeping adverse events under the rug, and nobody can be trusted. You know, and that type of story, you know, was one that the vaccines caused a lot of suffering and untold suffering and deaths. And it's now just a scandal that's beginning to unfold. So there are these two stories. And as a physician and someone who has extensively covered COVID, and I get asked all the time, should I still get the vaccine? I think it's really important for us to stop and think about how we got into this place. Because in the end, you know, this topic is so confusing and so charged. Right now, we are ourselves, as scientists and public health experts, we're wondering, you know, is listening going to be more impactful than us just continuing to talk on these same talking points?
Right.
Yeah. I want to commission a poll. Do we have any money, Brenda?
Yeah, let me look in my piggy bank.
Let's get a poll.
I'll give you a series of letters, and you tell me which is scarier.
Okay.
mRNA.
Oh, no.
Or MMR.
Oh.
Which is scarier?
I like them both.
I know, but I think for a lot of people, mRNA is scarier than measles, mumps, and rubella. Like,
well, mRNA, Q, I'm going to alter your DNA.
I don't know.
Well, yeah.
Because everybody knows that DNA goes to RNA, goes to proteins, right?
Oh my gosh.
Sure.
Okay, nerding out with the physician and the virologist. Okay, Tom and I need to leave the room so they can nerd out.
Yeah, but that is really what people, I mean, I think the number is that 15% of Americans like still think to this day that the mRNA vaccine will alter your DNA.
Yeah.
That was really surprising
we're going
to me.
To Dr. Offit about it, but just generations upon generations of Americans now have never seen the effects of these horrible viruses.
Right.
What America seems to be scared of or skeptical about is a new science-created RNA vaccine that's never been tested before, and in a crisis it's rushed out. That's the scary thing, not voracious disease that can kill, maim, blind children.
Right. And also that it's resulted. We all went through COVID. We saw, what COVID did to much of this country. But now, since the pandemic, you have nearly a third of Americans who believe the vaccine is more dangerous than the disease itself.
Yeah.
You have, folks, like you said, who believe that there's, what was it you said about the DNA?
It alters.
Yeah, that they believe that the vaccine, once you inject it into your body, that it's going to alter your DNA permanently.
So something happened during COVID with the rollout of the vaccines and its fallout that is leading us to this moment where now, Tom, you were looking at this, you're seeing vaccine exemption requests go up.
Yeah, and a lot of folks are focusing on that now. Among kindergartners in the 2022-23 school year, exemption rates, this is parents applying for, demanding an exemption for their child. I want to enroll my child in the public school, but I do not want to give them the vaccines, the standard vaccines. That exemption rate has risen in 41 states. So you are seeing an erosion of this mandatory get your child vaccinated in order to put them into public school.
So look, I think we got to kind of talk about how we got to this moment. And we were laughing because I feel like there's always this point in this podcast where we turn to Tom and we're like, Tom, how did we get here? Yes. So now this is the time of the podcast.
Don't bore us. Don't quickly. Keep it on point.
We can play some like house music behind him. But so Tom, seriously though, how did we get?
Let me take you back in time.
Yes. Diddly-doo, as they said in the world.
So yeah, I mean, the Operation Warp Speed, we all remember that. It took just 11 months from the first cases in America.
Worst name ever. Can we just talk about that? Operation Warp Speed is not a name that engenders trust.
Right.
I think it's
that you're like feeding through a vaccine is just not what you want to tell people. I am going on the record as saying that's a bad name.
Right.
Yeah,
Continue.
At the time, I mean, people were dropping dead.
Yeah.
So they wanted something fast. But
I get it, but I'm just saying like that was not like people still tell me today Operation Warp Speed does not make me feel good about getting a
But this was monumental. Partnership, you got government, you got the private sector. They developed, they test, they approved 2 vaccines. This could have taken years, right?
Yeah, exactly, Tom. So it typically will take, 5 to 10 years. And I think that's where some of the confusion comes in, is the amount of time it took for the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine versus historically what it's taken. And Pfizer and Moderna came to the stage and produced these mRNA vaccines, which were a brand new approach to vaccinating mass numbers of the public, but was critically important to us being able to do this in 11 months. And basically, this mRNA vaccine will send instructions to your body's cells to teach them how to recognize and respond to a virus. They don't change the DNA.
Are you sure?
I'm sure.
And how is this different than what we've always done?
Yeah, so different. And this is the thing that's fascinating to me, is people in the public started getting really interested in this approach. But we've had lots of different approaches to vaccines. We have vectored vaccines. We have inactivated particle vaccines, all basically with the point of showing your body some component of the virus so your body can learn how to respond. It's basically giving them the recipe to respond before you see the actual threat. And so in that way, you can reduce the symptoms and have a better immune response. And the mRNA vaccine is different because it's putting the message to make the protein in. And that is happening locally, whereas the other responses are typically a systemic response. So that means it goes all over your body.
But can I jump in and just add, like, when just regular folk out there, and I put myself in this category, why are we scared of the mRNA technology? It's because we are being told that it's never been used in this context. Right? And so help me feel better about that. Why should I be okay with something that's never been used before in this context? And now it's been used here. Why should I believe and why should I trust that I should take it?
And there'd been, 25 years of research into mRNA vaccines. I mean, I saw some really cool approaches to vaccinating against hemorrhagic fevers and things like that, where this technology could really change how we do things. But there wasn't the need for innovation in the vaccine world until the pandemic. There wasn't the need to have something that could be rapidly modified to get new vaccines out. I mean, think about influenza. We're typically predicting what needs to be in the vaccine 6 months to a year out based on what's circulating in other parts of the world. And for this, there were so many cases. We needed something that could be fast, could happen in anywhere. And then.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the stakes were so high that in some way we should, ask ourselves, did we make the right decision by going with something so brand new? And could we have predicted like the pushback? And should we have just paused for a beat and, maybe just given a vaccine that wasn't like, brand spanking new? But we couldn't.
Yeah. I mean, I guess where I'm coming from is I'm not sure I buy, had it been better explained, would more people trust it? I mean, I think at a certain point, we've talked about how it's a leap of faith. Like, I'm not a doctor. Like, I don't know what you're really talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You're making sounds. You're saying this. You're saying that. Like, I just sort of have to trust that you guys have our backs. Like, you guys are doing the best thing that you think you can do. I choose to trust you.
Yeah.
I choose not to trust the podcaster or my cousin on X who's saying these things are bad and here's the proof. Like, at a certain point, we have to trust. Right?
Yeah, and we did get to that point where they put out the key information that was like, okay, we studied it. Here's what we got, and we said it was 95% effective.
So let's talk about that, because that's also come up.
It's like a first step in the story kind of going sideways.
Yeah, because you talk about how this is like a Rorschach test, right? I remember Francis Collins writing in his book that when he saw the 95% effectiveness, he started crying because it was such an effective
But do you notice
thing.
what we're saying? We're just saying 95% effective, and we're ending the sentence right there.
Yeah, effective at what?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the part that's confusing, right? So the trial, in order for the trial to be clean and to be believable and to not have variables that mix it all up, we have to have a really clear question.
Right.
And the clear question was, does it prevent symptomatic COVID, and does it prevent you from having a serious illness or ending up in the hospital? That is what the 95% effective was. It wasn't at preventing you from getting infected. It was from preventing you from showing symptoms or looking like you had.
You still get it.
The words that were showing up, because I worked in news at the time, when you looked at like the New England Journal of Medicine, when you looked at the studies, it was saying 95% at preventing COVID
illness or COVID symptoms, right? And so we're really splitting hairs here. And from a public health perspective, we're just trying to get the message out that it works. So we're trying to simplify it in a way that's palatable, understandable. And so we just say 95% effective. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem is that kind of backfires, because then you say it's 95% effective, and all of a sudden you still see people who got the vaccine but still got sick or still transmitted.
Or still tested positive because they had an asymptomatic infection.
Yeah. And the trials never talked about asymptomatic infection. That wasn't what they were designed. If we really wanted to answer all those questions, we would have never had an answer. It would have just been too complicated. We would not have been able to get a clear answer. Does this work?
Right.
But it just creates so much confusion, because at the time we quickly go from, oh my God, we have an EUA, it's December 2020, and then, let's go.
Right.
The headlines are, when are Americans going to be able to get it? It's all out in all 50 states. I mean, we saw images.
Yeah, who's getting it first?
Who's getting it first?
Second wave.
Trucks going out, huge warehouses being emptied. Wow, the huge rollout. I mean, I remember there was this nurse who got it, and we put it on live television. This person is the first person to get this vaccine at this hospital. I mean, all across the country. We quickly just went on from great, it's effective, boom, let's go.
Right. This is where I do think it's important to talk about the media ecosystem we live in right now, which is that we're no longer people tuning in to one news program where everyone is going to be watching that one person every single day say the one most authoritative thing. It is now multiple news programs in multiple different channels with multiple people saying multiple things. And so for that reason, I can understand why confusion was the name of the game when somebody, whether it's Anthony Fauci or the New England Journal of Medicine or USA Today, paraphrasing what Anthony Fauci and the New England Journal of Medicine were saying, where you have me at home then thinking, A 95% effective vaccine means I'm never going to get COVID and I am out of the woods, Because the truth is, for instance, if I get a measles vaccine, I'm never going to get measles. If I get like a polio vaccine, I'm never going to get polio. So my thinking is once you get a vaccine, you never get the thing.
Well, I don't know that that's true.
Yeah.
That's not true.
Yeah. So you might
Really?
still get the virus, but I think that's also where messaging got confusing because COVID is the disease. It's the disease caused by SARS-CoV-2. You can still get that virus. Measles vaccine will protect you, but you'll still, if you were to encounter somebody with measles, your body would then know how to handle it. So you could still get the virus.
Or a mild version.
Or a mild version.
It's not going to kill you.
But it wouldn't kill you. And I think that messaging got confusing to the public. And it's something that virologists, well, I didn't do a very good job. Many of us virologists kept being like, actually, please stop saying COVID. It's SARS-CoV-2.
But there weren't podcasts back in the 50s to dissect the,
no,
the
there
messaging,
were.
the messaging around polio.
Yeah.
Podcasting would have been awesome in the 50s.
Right.
But look, let's, I
know where this kind of story takes us, which is even, President Biden's coming out saying you're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations. But all of a sudden, people are getting reinfected. So right there, you have this break, which is they said, if I got the vaccine, I wouldn't get infected again.
Yeah.
And boom, people are getting infected again.
With what?
With COVID.
With what kind of COVID?
Well,
right? So
what do you mean?
changes.
Yeah, you're saying.
Oh, the strain.
Yeah,
Right.
that's part two of this, which is I won't speak for public health, but public health, I
Thank
think,
God you're not speaking for public
in,
health.
in retrospect, would have liked to have maybe had a mulligan on this and would have explained much more about how viruses, this one's new, but viruses we know mutate. And when a virus mutates, guess what? We're going to have to redo the vaccine and we're going to have to reissue the vaccine. And then we're going to have to ask you to come back and get another shot. Yeah. That sort of got left out of this initial push to get everybody to line up for the vaccine.
And it was no surprise to virologists, right, that viruses will mutate. And that was something we were discussing from day one was when we have protective measures, how will that impact the virus? And then as viruses came up, we saw that public health was they just didn't want to confuse the public, right? So they wanted the public to roll up their sleeves and get vaccinated. That's a simple, concise message.
Yeah. I mean, and then, the ball gets rolling and then there starts to be like this barrage of claims about the vaccine, that it can cause infertility, that there's microchips, that there's nanotechnology, that's got blinking lights in you. It was made out of aborted fetuses. I mean, it increases your risk of cancer. It alters your DNA. We already talked about that. I mean, all of those things are not true, but the vaccine was there. The skepticism was there. I mean, you even had, when, Buffalo Bills DeMar Hamlin collapsed in the middle of the field right away. It was
within seconds. I remember texting a friend at the time and we were just like, are you looking at what's happening on Twitter right now? People are saying this is because of the COVID vaccine.
Yeah. I mean, and it was just, it was like a knee-jerk reflex. He fell. He's a young guy. Had to be from the COVID vaccine. I mean, turns out it was proven that it wasn't from the COVID vaccine. I mean, he had this incredible stroke of bad luck. He got hit just at the right time with this rare cardiac arrest from trauma. And here we are.
Right. There were bad faith actors out there stirring the pot and putting some really bad information out into the ecosystem. And I know at some point a research group found that something like 12 individuals were behind like a whopping 65% of just purely false information about the COVID vaccine. But look, I want to just underscore something here, which is that being worried, being hesitant, even being a little bit skeptical of a new vaccine is totally real. It's legitimate. I know in the initial run-up, I was a little bit like, oh, is this going to be okay? But if you're reading about, aborted fetuses being put into vaccines and chip technology and all of this stuff, that is just patently false.
Yeah.
And we're not here to equate that. But I do think they were lumped in a lot of times together. Folks reading just conspiracy theory, bad information with just actually valid hesitation and concern were often put together in the same category.
And that raises the whole censorship issue because a lot of people who might have been fearful, scared, confused, they go seeking information and then they're suddenly seeing this account's been suspended or this message has been taken down, it's false. And they think, what what's going on here? Like what's being hidden from me? And that starts to grow. 1 in 3 Americans right now think the COVID vaccine is the cause of thousands of deaths of Americans.
That's staggering to me because the virus itself is so much more dangerous. And yes, vaccines in very rare instances can cause myocarditis, adverse events. It's listed on anytime you get a vaccine, even the influenza, every time you go in, there's a whole page of things that can happen. And then you sign and you get the shot. But SARS-CoV-2 can also cause myocarditis almost 10 times more than the vaccine.
So you're saying COVID itself, the actual virus
is
itself,
a much bigger driver of this dangerous heart condition, myocarditis,
yes,
than the vaccine is proving to be.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, look, we have talked a lot about numbers here. We've talked a lot about science and the facts. We also, as you guys know on the show, we are hoping to speak with folks who had personal experiences. And we had the privilege the other day to speak with Daniel King. Our friends at Braver Angels connected us with him. As you know, they're an organization that we've been working with. They bring together people, Republicans, Democrats, just people who feel differently about issues together to have those conversations with grace, with compassion, with civility. Daniel he's a veteran of the U.S. military. He served in Syria. He's a father and a husband. And during COVID, he was designated an essential worker, doing his job as a commercial truck driver. At one point during the pandemic, Daniel was stationed at Fort Drum in upstate New York, where he did rigorous training drills. And he said he was in the best shape of his life at the time. Today, Daniel says he is suffering and that after nearly 3 years of seeing countless doctors, trips to the ER, taking tests, more tests, no one can provide him with the things he says he desperately needs, which are empathy, trust, that this isn't all just something that he's making up in his head, and a commitment to figure out what happened to his health. Now, Daniel said that before the pandemic, he always used to support vaccines. He'd gotten them for himself, for his children, that he always trusted science. But all that changed one day when he got a COVID booster shot. Let's take a listen.
I remember the time. That day, that time, my life changed forever. Like, I don't think it'll ever be the same again. Yeah, we had just gotten done doing a training exercise, and I was up for probably 12 hours before I got the booster. Okay, like I knew it was coming. It was just a matter of time. I went over, I got it. I was in the back of my unit for more than a couple minutes, and all of a sudden I got severe side pain, like right at the bottom of my rib cage. It started hurting like crazy, and I'm like, what in the world's going on? But I chalked it up to muscle fatigue. Like I said, we had just done extensive training, and we got released for the day, and I was so sick. Like I had a headache, like it was like nobody's business. Like it was so bad. I don't think I really started to worry about anything until I started having stroke-like symptoms. That's when I started freaking out. And that was about 2.5 weeks after the vaccination. I couldn't move my left arm. I couldn't move my left leg. And like my left side of my face was all droopy. I couldn't necessarily form a sentence. So they did a CAT scan, and they were basically rolling out a stroke, because they were 100% sure I'm having a stroke. They were like, well, did anything happen? And all I told them was like, well, yeah, I got the vaccine like 2.5 weeks ago. But then it was probably about 2 hours later, they discharged me because they said, we don't see anything life-threatening at this point. About a week after that is where my trust for doctors crashed, because I went to the emergency room again by the guidance of my primary care, and he recommended I go to a bigger hospital. And at that point, I had done a little bit of research, but not an extensive amount. And I rolled some things out, and they just pretty much laughed at me, and they said, no, this is what we call conversion disorder.
I mean, in a way, it's them saying that we have no explanation for this. There's no physical explanation. The CAT scan box is checked, the MRI, EKG. We don't know what it is. There's no medical explanation for this. It's an unsatisfying thing to hear, but it is a real thing. I mean, there are people who have these things.
Like I had this discussion with my doctor, From the time I got told in the ER that I have conversion disorder till about August or September of 2022, he stopped all medical. Like, he would not send me anywhere for any kind of workup because he was like, "This is just in your head. The best thing for you is to go to behavioral health therapy."
Do you feel that your doctor, other doctors you're seeing for these tests and to chase down what's happening, do you feel that they're just sort of passing you through and passing you along, and or do you feel like there's an honest, deep effort to get to the bottom of this?
No, I definitely feel like I'm just being passed along, because the biggest problem I'm having right now is they're reading my charts and they're seeing conversion disorder and they're latching onto that before I'm even being seen by them. And as soon as I bring up the COVID vaccine, everything goes out the window. They're just like, it's in your head. I'm on this place where it could be from COVID that I had, it could be from vaccine, or it could be a combination of both.
In your mind, does it matter, or is what matters to you being listened to, a treatment option, and then recovery?
For me today, it matters more being listened to and a treatment option and recovery. Let's listen to me, let's figure it out, and let's move forward.
If there were another pandemic today, would you get a vaccine?
As of today, no. I don't see a future of the kids getting vaccinated because this watching their dad go through this scarred them for the rest of their life. And will they trust it? I can't see that far in the future. I'm just going based off of what they talk about today. And having to take care of your dad and having to watch him go through what he's going through.
And can you put into words how this experience has left you in terms of your trust in doctors, in science, in public health, in vaccines? Like, where do you?
I mean, and okay, before I say it, like, I need everybody to understand, like, this is where I'm at today. That doesn't say this is going to change in a year from now, in a month from now. Like, but as of today, I have zero trust. Absolutely zero.
Boy, I just found Daniel so moving and so compelling.
I mean, he is what every patient wants. It's just to be heard and to help him, whether it's from the vaccine or not. He is telling you he's sick and he is really struggling and he needs to be heard.
Right. We just want to thank our friends at Braver Angels for introducing us to Daniel. We are so glad we spoke with him. And in fact, we sent notes from his call to Dr. Paul Offit, and Dr. Paul Offit has also heard his story. So we're going to talk to Dr. Paul Offit next. And as we said, he's a world-renowned vaccine specialist, infectious disease doctor, pediatrician, and he's talked a lot about a lot of the things that Daniel brought up. Now our conversation with Dr. Paul Offit. Dr. Paul Offit, welcome to Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So good to see you. So, look, Dr. Offit, you've now heard the story of Daniel King. You've read the notes. Thank you so much, by the way, for all of that. Here you have this person. He served his country. He was not anti-vaccine before the pandemic. He got the vaccine. He got his children vaccinated. Yet he experienced something really terrible, really confusing. And he feels completely let down by the medical establishment. My question is, does what happened to Daniel King during the pandemic represent a failure of the public health and medical system?
I think it represents something that's not atypical, which is that occasionally there are people who have signs and symptoms from which they suffer, and medicine doesn't have an answer. And it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating for the patient. It's very frustrating for the clinicians. And sometimes the clinicians will say things like, I think this is psychological, when it may not be. And I think it's I don't think this is unique to the pandemic. I mean, it may be that his continued symptoms are because of either his natural infection or his vaccination or both. That's certainly possible. But I think, if you ask people, for example, do you think we're going to know more about science and medicine 20 years from now than we know now? Everybody would say yes. But when it comes to their disease, they want you to know everything you need to know when you might not. And I think that's frustrating for everybody. And I certainly see how he can want to reject the whole thing, but that's never really a good solution.
Just on Daniel's story, when you heard it, I mean, what went through your mind? What do you think is happening with Daniel?
Not sure. I mean, certainly there are long COVID is a probably more than one thing. It may be because viruses continue to replicate. It may be because there's this sort of hyper immune system, which just doesn't get turned off. It may be because there's sort of this micro clotting that certainly can happen with this virus, or it may be just the psychological effect of having the initial severe symptoms. I don't know. I think we're just learning about this, and this may not be long COVID at all. I don't know, but I certainly have experience on the other side, meaning on the physician side, having patients come in who have symptoms that are for them debilitating, and you can't figure it out. And it's frustrating for everybody. I don't think this is unique to the pandemic. I think this has always been true, meaning medicine has limits. There's things we don't know, things we can't do, and that's hard for everybody to accept, the clinicians and the patient alike.
If you can just put your clinician's hat to the side for a second, just on a human level, what goes through your mind? What are your emotions when you hear Daniel tell his story?
No, I feel sickened. I mean, so here's a person who trusts us, trusts the healthcare system, trusts the medical establishment, if you will, and he feels very much let down by it. And he tried to play by the rules. He played by the rules. He did everything he was asked to do, and yet he's still suffering, and nobody knows why. And I think he feels abandoned, and that's heartbreaking.
Paul, is he abandoned? I mean, I think he is really wanting an answer. His symptoms and his story was reported. He did what he felt like he had to do. Who on the other end is receiving that information? And right now, one of the biggest questions about vaccines moving forward is, the new administration has said, we want everybody to know what the risks are and to make an informed decision. How does he know that somebody heard what happened to him? It went through the proper protocol, was reported to the CDC, FDA, through the quarterly system or whatever it is, and somebody has analyzed his information and no signal has arisen from what he has said.
Right. So when vaccines are licensed and recommended, usually it's because they've been tested in tens of thousands of people, but not hundreds of millions. And so when the vaccine then is out there, there are systems in place to try and pick up rare adverse events. And you saw that with the mRNA vaccines. There was myocarditis, which occurred at roughly 1 in 50,000 people, but that wasn't picked up when you tested basically 35,000 adults in December, or you had those data in December of 2020. And J&J's vaccine, the adenovirus vector vaccine, which was licensed or authorized in February 2021, was found to be a very rare cause of dangerous blood clotting, including fatal blood clotting as high as 1 in 250,000 people. So there are those systems in place, and that's the vaccine safety data link, which gives you got the vaccine or didn't get the vaccine. The VAERS system, vaccine adverse events reporting, is got the vaccine, had a problem. So that can raise the question, which it did for myocarditis. I mean, suddenly there were these reports of myocarditis, so then you could look to see whether or not it was occurring at a greater level in the vaccine group than the placebo group. But I'll say, as a member of the Vaccine Advisory Committee, when we sat down in December of 2020 to review these data, we reviewed 800 pages of data, basically for those two meetings on December 10th and December 17th. And so we looked at data on basically 35,000 adults that got that vaccine. But you knew the other shoe was going to drop, because it always does. You're making a recommendation for tens of thousands of people when a vaccine is about to be given to hundreds of millions of people, and it always drops. There's always a human price to pay for knowledge, and that was true here too, both for the myocarditis and the clotting. But to think that that's the only thing that's possible is to lack the humility that we need to have here, which is there may be things we're missing.
Paul, there is an impression right now amongst many people who mistrust the science and public health and medical establishment that in the zeal to get this vaccine out, that the side effects and the safety profile of this vaccine was deliberately underplayed. And now you have the latest polls show that a majority of Americans feel that way. That the side effects is a real issue of the COVID vaccine, and that it's actually leading to some pretty dramatic just declines in vaccine uptake for all vaccines, but certainly the COVID vaccine. If somebody were to say to you, is public health being as transparent as possible about adverse events? Like, clearly this country is nervous about adverse events around vaccines. What can we say to people who are really nervous about that?
I think the CDC does a good job at looking at these vaccine adverse events reports to see whether or not there's a cluster that suggests that it's a causal rather than coincidental relationship. I think the Vaccine Safety Data Link and as well as sort of academic institutions and researchers look for this. I do think people are looking, but I completely agree with you. I think people have lost trust in the public health system. I think, and as well as in other aspects of government system. So it's not just, I think, unique to public health agencies. And I feel what's happened now is we're not scared of COVID anymore. The pandemic's over. If you define a pandemic as something that changes the way you live, work, or play, we're back to normal. But the virus isn't over. That virus is still circulating. And so that vaccine does still benefit people who haven't been naturally infected or vaccinated. But I think you're right. We now look at children less than 5 years of age, where fewer than 5% are vaccinated. That children less than 5 years of age account for 6% of all emergency department admissions now, or visits, for croup, bronchitis, et cetera, bronchiolitis. So the virus is still around, but you're right. We've lost faith. We have absolutely lost faith. I have no idea how to get it back. I'm not sure what, if ever, is going to allow us to get it back, but we lost faith. And I think in large part it is because of the ready access of misinformation. I do think that's a big part of this. I'll give you an example. Richard Besser was the head of the CDC in 2009 during the swine flu pandemic. And he was out in front of the media every day, every other day. He was great. He was answering questions until people stopped asking questions, meaning the media, which is to say the public. And he would be doing this every 2 days, every 3 days. I saw him at a recent meeting and I said, you were great. Thanks so much for what you did. And he said to me, thank you, I appreciate that. I could never do it today. I said, why? He said, social media.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is that you think that there's something about this particular media moment that is adding to this mistrust, that it's not just what public health and science are doing in your estimation, that there are bad actors out there that are stirring the pot, that are making people mistrustful.
But there's also like this vacuum, right, that's been sort of created maybe because public health didn't seize it with this sort of nonstop messaging out to the public. And like you've pointed out, Brenda, that like RFK Jr. and Joe Rogan now are actually the most prominent voices in public health. I mean, Paul, when we say that, do you agree with that? And how do you feel about that?
Completely. I agree with you completely. I really wish we would do, I think, what Richard Besser did in 2009, which is go on Rogan, go on Fox. I mean, get your message out there again and again and again, that we do care and that we are looking. I think it's not just a COVID vaccine problem. You have the CDC recently reporting in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly report that a higher percentage of parents are choosing not to vaccinate their kindergartners than ever before. And you're seeing the result of that. In 2023, we had 5,000 cases of pertussis. In 2024, we had 32,000 cases. That's more than pre-pandemic levels. In 2023, we had, I think, 3 or 4 outbreaks of measles associated with 55 cases. 2024, we had 16 outbreaks associated with almost 280 cases. We're going in the wrong direction. And I think that's only going to get worse over time as people become more and more distrustful of vaccines. And I think what breaks my heart about the story of Daniel is that he's now, his position is, the hell with it. I'm not going to believe these people at all anymore.
That's right.
And I that's the real tragedy.
We've in some ways we've sort of lost somebody who I think didn't need to be lost.
You know, it strikes me also that the potency of the message among those who are in this sort of dissident community, it's really profound. I mean, we hear it from people that we talk to, everyday people that say, I'm worried about the health of our children, the safety of our children. And that's why I am really worried about these vaccinations. That's literally the same argument that people who are promoting vaccines say, that in order to keep the child safe and healthy, you need a vaccine. But this other side, this skeptical side has flipped that around, that if you're in favor of children's health and children's safety, you should be weary of the vaccines, not promoting the vaccines. What is that? How does that sit with you?
All right, so I'm going to hopefully I can do this quickly. I'll try and go through the last 100 years. My parents were children of the 1920s. Their parents, my grandparents, were scared of diphtheria, which killed 15,000 children a year, and whooping cough, which killed 8,000 children a year. Me and my brother or sister are children of the 50s, 1950s. So there was a diphtheria vaccine. There was a pertussis vaccine. My parents weren't scared of that. What they were scared of was polio, which caused 30,000 cases of paralysis and 1,800 deaths a year. They were scared of measles, which killed 500 children a year and caused 1,000 children to have encephalitis, inflammation of the brain, which a quarter of whom would have permanent brain damage. They were scared of mumps because it was the most common cause of acquired deafness. They were scared of rubella, which when it infected women in the first trimester would result in 85% of the offspring having permanent defects of the eye, ear, and heart, deafness, blindness, heart defects. I trained in the late 1970s at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. When I would do my emergency department rotation, I would do 2 to 3 spinal taps a night. Why? Because we didn't have a meningococcal vaccine or a pneumococcal vaccine or a Haemophilus influenza B vaccine, all of which cause meningitis. Today, the residents at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia don't know how to do spinal taps. They don't do them enough. So when a child comes in with a question of bacterial meningitis, that child is tapped by the interventional radiologist. My children were born in the 1990s. My wife and I weren't scared of any of those diseases. And that's the problem. The problem is that not only have we largely eliminated these diseases, we've eliminated the memory of these diseases. And so we're much more susceptible to the notion that vaccines are causing more harm than good. And there's plenty of misinformation out there to inform us of that.
Paul, I really enjoyed your quick breakthrough of the last 100 years. I think what struck me was that fears were really what was driving people's want to get vaccinated for these different threats. And, we see things like measles cases rising and chickenpox cases rising, all these things that we have a good preventative measure, but that the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine and those efforts kind of ended up derailing, and all in the push for being afraid of chronic conditions, which is where I think people are now. I see viruses as having a lot of potential to trigger these chronic conditions, but they take a lot of time. And so do you think that plays a factor where instead of seeing the acute full body rash or paralysis from polio, that now people are more afraid of these long-term symptoms, that they're easier to associate with things that we know we were exposed to versus a virus you pick up from a door handle?
Right. I mean, we live longer than we used to. Right, 100 years. We live 30 years longer than we did 100 years ago. And you could argue that's because of vaccines. So vaccines have made us live longer, which means that we have a greater chance of developing chronic diseases. So in that sense, I guess vaccines cause you to live longer and therefore cause more chronic disease. I don't know. I mean, I think certainly Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s whole point is that we have simply substituted infectious diseases with chronic diseases. And I just don't really see clear evidence for that. I think vaccines have been enormously beneficial. Where I think we made a mistake, and this was what you were talking about earlier. I think in 2020, we didn't have anything, right? We had a virus that came into this country that was killing hundreds and thousands of people a day, and we had nothing. We didn't have antivirals till October. We didn't have monoclonals till November. We didn't have vaccines till December. We just had to avoid human-to-human contact. That's it. That's all we had. And so we closed schools, we shuttered businesses, we restricted travel, we masked, we isolated, we quarantined, we tested. And I think that worked. I mean, at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, typically October, November, December, we are flooded with respiratory syncytial virus and influenza virus. We didn't see a single case of influenza or RSV infection in the winter, in that first winter. Imagine how much worse COVID would have been. And then in 2021, you were 12 times where you had a vaccine. You were 12 times more likely to be hospitalized and die if you didn't get vaccinated than if you got vaccinated. So we mandated vaccines. And do I think that was the right thing to do? Yes. I mean, help us out. Our hospital was overwhelmed with that virus. And I work at a children's hospital. We had 3 floors of COVID. This so-called multi-system inflammatory disease problem was something I'd never seen before. And we were overwhelmed by that, right? Child gets sick, gets better, then comes back a month later with severe COVID. I'd never seen that before. And so my thinking was, help us out. Here you want us to take care of your children. Get vaccinated. But it was seen, now you couldn't go to your favorite bar or restaurant or a place of worship or sporting event unless you had your card, and that too was seen as massive overreach. And so that's what you're seeing now. I think we've given people a reason in many ways to push back on this, because we did make some mistakes during the pandemic in describing what this vaccine could or couldn't do.
Well, I guess that gets at a real fundamental kind of a point about vaccines, is that they're only effective if you take them. And so, what you're getting at as far as the mandates, I think is a central tenet of outrage and concern amongst this community of folks mistrustful in science and public health, which is they don't want to be forced to do anything involving health and medicine. And COVID for them represented almost a criminal level of overreach, to the point where you had the president at the inauguration this week saying that he was going to roll back, or what was
the executive order?
The
reinstate
members of the military who refused to adhere to the vaccine mandates in the military were pushed out of the military without pay, and he's reinstating them with back pay. You're
seeing a trend right now where most of Americans actually do believe in vaccines, and they believe in the efficacy of vaccines, and particularly childhood vaccines. I think we talk a lot about the declining rate, but for the most part, Americans, I think over 70% of Americans believe that childhood vaccines are good. But where the trend line is going down is that parents are saying, but you can't make me force my kid to take it. And how do we deal with this tension of you need vaccines, but you got to take them in order for us to be healthy?
So this whole movement, medical freedom movement, if you will, has certainly taken hold. I saw there was a big article in the New York Times about it, and that's what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says. He'll say, that he likes one person or another because they've done a great job on the medical freedom movement. But, if you step on a rusty nail, and you go to the doctor and your doctor says, I would like you to get a tetanus vaccine, and you say no, and you get tetanus, no one's going to catch tetanus from you. Not a contagious disease. But SARS-CoV-2 it's a contagious disease. And so is that your right? Is it your right to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection? Remembering that there's probably about 10 million people in this country who can't be vaccinated. They can't be vaccinated because they're getting cancer chemotherapy or they're getting immune suppressive therapy for their rheumatologic diseases. Do they matter? There was one dramatic moment actually in California when a state senator named Richard Pan decided to eliminate the philosophical exemption to vaccines in a state that didn't have a religious exemption, which would have left California with only a medical exemption. And obviously the anti-vaccine people were all over that. Eliminating, vaccine exemptions is probably the worst thing you can do in terms of making them angry. So they went to meeting after meeting, and there was this little boy named Rhett Crowett who had acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And he would stand up at those meetings. He was little, so they had to put him on a stool so he could reach the microphone. And he would say, I have leukemia. I can't be vaccinated. I depend on you to protect me. Don't I count? And see, to me, he was the voice of society. This medical freedom, to me, means the freedom to do whatever you want, independent of how it affects the next person. And there's a great film called The Polio Crusade by Sarah Colt Productions out of Boston. And if you watch this, you hear the voices of the 1950s. And it's just a different voice. It's like, how can we help our neighbor? I mean, think about it. The polio vaccine was basically from the March of Dimes. The public paid for that vaccine, paid for the research, paid for the distribution of that vaccine. And maybe it's because we were just coming off the shared national tragedy of World War II, but we saw polio for what it was, which was a shared national
You
tragedy.
had Elvis Presley getting the shot. You had, I mean, it was an incredible national consensus around it. People wanted to get this vaccine.
Yeah, that's right. And because, first of all, polio was a fear disease. I mean, when that announcement was made in 1955, that Jonas Salk's vaccine worked, my mother cried. This was a fear disease. I would just splash around this little plastic pool in our backyard with my two first cousins because they never wanted us to go to a public swimming pool. Summer camps were in many ways invented in Vermont or Maine or New Hampshire to get kids out of the city because of fear of polio. Polio was a fear disease. And you could see it. When Mitch McConnell said it's dangerous to take away the polio vaccine, I mean, he suffered polio as a child. And even Donald Trump,
yeah.
who said, he was born in 1946, so he was born 10 years before the vaccine. He remembers, he has that immediate reaction to the notion of losing a polio vaccine.
Right. And that's why, in my estimation, I don't think anything's going to, I mean, I'm saying it right here, folks.
I know.
I don't think anything's going to happen to the polio vaccine because there are, still people alive and well who remember what it was like, including the president of the United States. There's so much national support of it. But maybe what we're talking about is even discussing it now.
No, but just to think about, the argument is not, I'm taking it away. The argument is everybody deserves the right to make up their own mind about whether they're going to get their children vaccinated. And that sounds good, right? Everyone should make up their own mind about whether they're going to have their child be vaccinated or not.
Except for the little boy with
Except
leukemia.
it doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah.
For public health.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't work that way.
And I think that's the question that a lot of people have. This medical freedom movement that you talk about is about freedom of speech. It's about freedom of choice. And people are so confused with the amount of information out there. They actually go to their doctors now to ask them. And your message, Paul, isn't even hitting with some of the doctors. I mean, not every doctor is lining up to say the CDC recommendations are right. Right now, everybody's supposed to get 2 shots of COVID if they're over 65. But a lot of doctors are saying, wait a minute, nobody's dying of COVID at the rates that they were dying before. We don't need to do that. And so there's some confusion even within the medical community. And how do you, who are you talking to? Are you talking to the public? Are you talking to your doctor? Who do you trust? A lot of these people have, MDs and PhDs behind their name who aren't aligning with the CDC.
No, you're right. I think there certainly were mistakes that were made early on that I think has created a certain level of distrust, even among the group in the medical community. So, for example, in August of 2021, when President Biden stood up and said, as of September, we're going to have a third dose of vaccine. At the time, it was just a 2-dose vaccine for everyone. And our committee met, the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee met and rejected that for good reasons, as did the CDC Advisory Committee. And then you would have these people who would have, mild disease or asymptomatic infection, which the CDC described as breakthrough infections. Breakthrough is a bad word. It means failure. These weren't failures. The goal of the vaccine is to keep you out of the hospital and keep you from dying, and it was doing that. And then you had the bivalent vaccine in 2022, which wasn't a bad idea, but that vaccine was no better than what we had. And we were trumpeting it as if it was better when study after study showed that it wasn't. So you could see where you could start to lose faith among scientists or faith among clinicians. I get that. But the virus is still out there, and I think there are clearly high-risk groups that benefit. Even now, we recommend this vaccine in the United States for everybody over 6 months of age. We're only one of 2 countries that do that, us and Canada. Most countries in this world, Western Europe, Australia, Scandinavian countries, the World Health Organization, all recommend a yearly dose for people who are in high-risk groups. So already it continues to be confusing, and I understand that.
Paul, we are now in a new era of public health. There is a lot of concern amongst folks in mainstream science about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., about Dr. Oz, about the new crop of public health leaders. Where is there a chance to actually work with this group? So it's not just, we're hearing about them, his anti-vax stances and things like that. But where do you see some hope? Where do you see an opportunity to work with the incoming administration?
Okay, I'd like to preface this by saying I am a ridiculous optimist. I am a Philadelphia Eagles season ticket holder, okay? So
Go Birds, go Birds.
I have no faith that there is any way that anyone would be able to work with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He has, for the last 20 years, with Associated creating his Children's Health Defense Group, is an anti-vaccine zealot. He's a believer. This means something to him. He has said recently, no vaccine is safe and effective. He says when he meets somebody on a hiking trail who's carrying a child, he will go up to that parent and say, don't vaccinate your child, and feel that he has saved them. He doesn't believe HIV is the cause of AIDS. He says the polio vaccine has killed far more people, many more people than it saved. He doesn't believe in the germ theory. I mean, read his book, The Real Anthony Fauci.
But do you think that he will be somehow contained by the institutions? Like now he can't just like spout things off, right? He is the head of the biggest government agency besides the military. You know, he's already been forced to say things like, I believe in vaccines. I'm not doing anything with the poll. Like, do you think that the institutional strength around him will force him to have to not act on some of the things that he maybe would have in his previous life?
I think he believes that to the degree to which he can decrease vaccine rates in this country, he is saving children. He is a zealot. He believes this. I think there are not enough guardrails to put around him as head of HHS, which is a powerful position that will prevent him from doing that. He's sued HHS on the basis of sort of vaccines like Gardasil. He wanted in 2021. He wanted to have the FDA pull back on its emergency use authorization for COVID vaccines. I mean, how about if we have a bird flu outbreak? What's he going to do there? I don't trust him for a second. I think when he says he's not anti-vaccine, then no one's anti-vaccine, because you're anti-vaccine if you put out misinformation about vaccines with the purpose of convincing people not to get them. That's what an anti-vaccine activist is. I think he would be a nightmare. Honestly, it's read his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, pages 285 to 291. He does not believe in the germ theory, Brenda. He doesn't believe that specific germs cause specific diseases and that the prevention or treatment of those germs is of value. He believes in the miasma theory, as he says in his book. In case you weren't in Europe in the 1700s, the miasma theory is like the rotting sort of organic matter on the streets creates this bad air or miasma, and that can cause people to be ill. And if you just have a healthy immune system, that you're not going to have to worry about that. And that's why he talks about that. That's why he doesn't believe HIV causes AIDS, because he doesn't believe polio virus causes polio. If you look at his website, they listed polio virus as a toxin and not a virus. He's a nightmare. No, he would be awful in this position.
Paul, I wonder if you were a senator and could ask RFK Jr. a question about during his confirmation hearing, again, considering he's going to be head of potentially HHS, which oversees our CDC, FDA, NIH, what would you ask him?
Okay, I get one question. Here's what I'd ask him. You have said on Lex Friedman's podcast in 2023, when asked the question, do you think any vaccine is valuable? You said no. You thought no vaccine was a benefit. If you had children now, would you vaccinate them according to the CDC schedule? Would you give them every vaccine according to that routinely recommended schedule? And if not, why not? And which ones wouldn't you give? And if you would give it, then why are you saying what you're saying?
Dr. Offit, I want to take you back, sort of putting RFK to the side, back to the beginning. It's our last question, and back to Daniel and his story. The name of our podcast, as you know, is Why Should I Trust You? After all Daniel's been through, why should he trust you?
Well, so see, and that's what it comes down to, right? It comes down to the person. In theory, it really shouldn't. It should come down to the data. I mean, who has data that can help him? Right now, the medical community has let him down because we haven't figured out what he has. But that doesn't mean that we're completely untrustworthy or that science is untrustworthy. I think what is most upsetting about what's going on for me now is, let's suppose you want to know whether or not vaccines cause autism, for example. Which is fair, right? My child got a vaccine. They were fine. Now that this thing has happened to them, could the vaccine have done it? That's an answerable question, right? And has been answered again and again and again. So it really shouldn't come down to what I say or what Andrew Wakefield says or what RFK Jr. says. It should come down to what the data say. But unfortunately, the data don't speak for themselves. And so you have people speaking for them. And if a person is charismatic and attractive and well-spoken, you're more likely to believe them than someone who's not. like a nerdy scientist, like myself, who's going to talk about, things that sound scientific and
you're well spoken enough.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's sad that it comes down to the messenger, but it always does. And then you're just at risk of how good the messenger is.
I don't know that mainstream science has a lot of incredibly effective messengers right now. I am somebody who my entire professional life, I've worked in messaging and media. And right now, I think that the folks who are skeptical of science have a very compelling message for a lot of folks in the public. And the folks defending science, what I worry is that the message is, for various reasons, not coming across as powerful. But I do think you are one of the few people who is able to cut through, but you are just one person. And so I'll just say that in this new era, if folks believe in anything, there needs to be a fire in their belly that kind of gets them out there beyond just, writing in medical journals and an op-ed here and there. There is a fire on the side of skepticism. And I think there needs to be a similar fire on the side of defending mainstream science.
No, I agree. I think I'm okay with skepticism. I think people should be skeptical about anything they put into their bodies. What I'm not okay with is cynicism, which is that even though studies have shown that the thing that you're concerned about is really not a concern, people just say, well, I don't believe that, because of course that's what they would say, because the big pharma is in charge and the journals are in the pocket of big pharma or whatever. And that's where people lose me. But I think you're right. I think scientists tend to think science speaks for itself, and it doesn't.
Well, listen, I know you have a flight to catch. Thank you so very much. This was a really good conversation. And I know that Daniel will really appreciate taking the time to listen to his story. Thanks, Dr. Offit.
Thank you.
So we just heard from Paul Offit.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, he has a lot to say, and a lot of people need to really pay attention to his message that the data is there, but it doesn't speak for itself. And it is so important who you listen to make your decisions.
Look, he is out there right now. Paul is everywhere. He is writing op-eds. He is writing, he is in television interviews, on podcasts. He's everywhere. But he is definitely not only championing an establishment view. And I think we are in an era right now where it is clear that anyone who occupies a space in the proverbial status quo needs to be seen as being reflective and having humility about mistakes made. I mean, whether or not you even think you need to be doing that, it seems like we're in an era right now where the public is demanding that anybody who's held a position in the establishment needs to kind of look back and say, well, we did this wrong. We did that wrong.
Yeah, and he wrote, an op-ed in the Times, I don't know, it was a week ago, saying, I am a vaccine skeptic.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, like I need the evidence, I need the proof, and I need it, times 1,000. I need to be absolutely assured. Otherwise, I am going to remain skeptical of this vaccine.
I mean, he feels the burden of his impact. I mean, he has to make a decision, a recommendation, and he does not take it lightly.
Right.
I think that's the most interesting thing to me about getting to listen to Paul is, all scientists are skeptics. That's kind of part of the draw, is that you're going to find a question and you're going to tear it apart. And you'll either find data that supports your hypothesis or not, but then you're going to push that data out. And what Paul really highlighted is that typically that's where it ends for academics, right? We get the paper out, the data's nice, we move on to the next question, but there needs to be that intermediary who's got the fire in the belly and championing that data, which isn't something we've needed previously, but is so incredibly important now, especially as people are questioning things and it's not clear how effective these things are if you're not trained and part of the academic system that's evaluating them.
Yeah.
Well, like you said, I mean, for a long time, it was don't engage, right? Isn't that?
Was,
like,
yeah.
You were told, like,
I was
in the science world, don't engage. And
don't engage in what?
Anti-vaccine sentiment. So for a long time, it was basically
or responding to
anti-vaccine sentiment, because for a long time it was seen that this was a fringe group and that engaging would only fuel it versus, and I think that looking back was a misstep. I mean, I think that there were people who were certainly engaging and certainly combating it. And we thought on the science side, well, this is settled. But I think what we should have done was more Vax Max energy, or like, like
an energy drink.
Yeah, exactly. So brought to you by Vax Max. No, a friend of mine called themselves that. A friend not in science, but like literally they would get any vaccine.
Just engage.
Engage.
Right.
I mean, look, part of it is we're in an arena right now where if you don't understand how the current media ecosystem works, you will lose the public.
Yeah.
You really will. I think Donald Trump has shown us that. I think Joe Rogan has shown us that. But really, it's the youth of America are showing us that all the time. You have pillars of media that are just crumbling wherever we are. Viewership is going down for mainstream media. In very few places are the mainstream kind of tried and tested ways of communicating to the public. All of that is being reinvented. It's been reinvented. And if science is not fully lockstep in that world and understanding of it, then these messages aren't going to get out.
And Paul really hit on something. There are several things that can be true at the same time, right? So Daniel's story is true. He has some sort of health issue, maybe related to the vaccine, maybe related to COVID. Paul himself said, we don't really know. It doesn't mean that your doctor has to turn their back against you. They can still help you sort through your medical issues, whether it's from the vaccine. And Paul is like a master class in that. I mean, public health is supposed to help people. It's not just supposed to say, follow these 5 steps. It is supposed to meet people where they are, find out where the needs are, right? That is what public health is supposed to do. So right now, public health's charge is not only get the vaccine, public health's charge is help me understand what is going on.
Yeah. I think it's interesting what he said about Kennedy.
I was just about to say, I want to know, like, I mean, he is very clear.
Yeah, he's clear. He does not think that it is possible to work with this person to improve public health in this country. And I think, look, we're in an interesting moment right now where I think a lot of progressives and liberals and the Democratic Party are sort of saying, okay, well, we got to figure out, how we work better and see the country for who it is. But Paul, under no circumstances, is budging on this.
Right.
He thinks that no matter what Robert F. Kennedy says in public right now about supporting that he's not anti-vax.
Well, he's saying he just doesn't want to take your vaccines away. All he's saying is, of late, is I just want people to know, does the vaccine work? And what are the risks? And then you make your decision.
Right.
That's what RFK's, message of du jour is.
Right.
And Mark, I think that's the point that gets under Paul's skin, is that he's not going to take away your individual right to get a vaccine, but that little boy in California, he's taking away.
Just raising those issues destabilizes our entire approach to vaccines. And without everybody rowing in the same direction and taking the vaccine, you're creating an opportunity for these viruses to ravage communities, and especially for children in schools who maybe take the vaccine, but their immune system's so compromised it doesn't work so well, or they can't take the vaccine. So they're depending on all the other children to get their vaccine so that the virus doesn't have any quarter.
Paul's got a fire in his belly, and I think that's great. I wish more people in science had a freaking fire in their belly like
RFK
Paul does.
has a fire in his belly.
But what I will say is, I mean, I think RFK Jr. is very likely going to be the next health secretary. And so regardless of, how much of a fight folks put in, the way that the political system is built right now, he will likely go through. He may not, and I will say otherwise, obviously, but if he goes through, he's the guy. And they're going to have to work with him.
And what do the Pauls do?
Right.
That's what's so crazy about this moment. Public health, what is public health? Well, public health is about to change.
Yeah.
As we said this at the top of the podcast.
Yeah.
Public health is about to change. Public health is going to be the dissident scientists, and the public health scientists of yesterday are going to be the new dissident scientists. I mean, what Paul will be in another pandemic, Paul will be on his camera from his home dispensing advice that could be absolutely contradictory to what's being said at a White House podium.
And ignored.
Unless RFK doesn't call Paul.
Right.
Right? Because now there are new voices.
And, 100%.
And you look at social media, you look at who is out there, to your point, Brenda, that there's the mainstream science, the Pauls of the world aren't that vocal.
No.
And they're not interacting with the public in the way that some of these other voices are. So Paul may not even get a call.
Oh, he wouldn't get a call. I'm just saying he's going to go rogue and be on his Zoom,
Right.
with us, with us, telling us information that's contradicting what public health is saying.
Look, this was a fascinating episode. I think vaccines obviously is not going to be the only time we cover this episode, but or this topic, I should say. I want to thank everyone for listening. I ask that you, if you like our new podcast, please rate it, please like it, please subscribe, please share. Thank you very much for joining us. Please email us at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net, and we'll see you next week.